Hi everyone and welcome back to a new episode of the video series of the Altitude Collection Infographics. Today we are starting our second episode of this season and we are going to be addressing the results and the main findings of our research conducted in 1965 in Peru. So we are going to travel to the past. So today, as you can see, Daniela is not with us, and the reason is because she is finishing a week in which a student from France has visited us. So she's finishing her interchange student program. But she will be with us in the upcoming 2 chapters where we will be focused on the results and the study conclusions. So this was a thrilling human physiology research. So do not blink or you will lost really interesting contents. So today is going to be a really long video and I hope you like it. So I might record this in different moments. As you know, I share this channel in Spanish and English. So too much work for my voice. Anyhow, today we are talking about an article which was published in 1967, May 1967, but it's part of a series of clinical and exercise physiology studies carried out in the small town of Nuñoa, right in the Peruvian Altiplano. It is about 3 hours south from Cusco town. So, the leading researcher who was part of this or who was in charge in this study was an anthropologist whose name is Paul Baker. Paul Baker was an anthropologist and was specialized in physical anthropology. What does study the physical anthropology, also known as biological anthropology? It's a social science discipline which studies the biological and behavioral aspects of human beings. I mean, for instance, what Paul Baker was doing in Andes in the 60s was basically studying the effects, for instance, of nutrition from Andeans who were living at high altitude on different anthropometrical characteristics from this population. For instance, body surface area, the height, the body mass, etc. So once we know what is biological anthropology or physical anthropology, we have to, I have also to let you know that in this study, and I published this in an entry, 4 entries that you can read. I have shared the entry link in the video descriptions. I published it last year. In September 8, the first entry, and you can read the 4 entries, which basically I call them something like anthropologists and physiologists were working together in Andes in the 60s. Why? Because Paul Baker and his colleague Mazess collaborated in this study with two members of the Human Performance Research Lab of Penn State. Paul Baker and Mazess were members of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Penn State, and they work in this first study with the Human Performance Research Lab from Penn State. Then they published two more papers that I'm going to show you in the next slide, or in the next video section. So Paul Baker arrives to Peru in 1962, to the town of Cusco, and then he moved to Chinchero. Both towns, Chinchero is a small village, they were approximately at 3,700 meter altitude. And then in 1964, he moved for study purposes to the town of Nuñoa, which is located at around 4,000 meters. He publishes two articles about cold stress thermoregulation, which I'm gonna briefly describe in the next chapter, in the second chapter, when we will talk about the introduction of this study. And he published as well a paper about nutritional behavior among Quechuas living at high altitude and its effect on their body structure. So, as I have mentioned, this study had a connection not only with the Human Performance Research Lab, who was directed by Professor Elsworth Buskirk, who was the president of the Physiological Society of the United States, and some members from this lab collaborated in this, let's say, multidisciplinary study. Those members were Prokop, who was a co-author from the paper we are addressing today, and also, Kollias, and then also Prokop and Akers were working in this multidimensional study carried out in the summer of 1965. Andean summer, so that was January 1965. So basically with this we can start to talk about this study. I'm gonna share right now the three papers which were published 2 years and 3 years after this research or this experiment was conducted. So I guess Paul Baker contact with Professor Buskirk between 1963 and 1964, and there's no data about that. I mean, there is data about the archives from this research, which includes letters from Buskirk or from other researchers to some other colleagues from the United States, or the connections, the letter which connected USA researchers with Peruvian researchers, are not held by the Penn State University. This is quite fun to me, but the archive, it belongs to the University of California, the UCLA, and because it's a payment or prepaid archives docs, I could not access them. So I guess Paul Baker in between 1963 and 1964 contact with Buskirk, and we have to understand what was the point with, in this case, high altitude training in the mid-60s. As Mexico was named the city to held the games in 1968, and these games would be held at an altitude of 2,630 meters, which is quite severe hypoxic conditions what athletes, especially endurance athletes, had to deal with in the events from or longer than 1 minute. So there were already in the literature, and I have shared a lot of these studies in my blog and as part of several issues of the altitude collection infographics. There were studies about human athletics performance after carry out a sojourn at 3,000 meters, which is 10,000, equivalent to 10,000 feet, and these papers were published by Deal, who everyone who likes human and exercise physiology knows who's Deal, and he was a co-Steele colleague. In fact, my next entry in my blog will be a Deal study conducted in Chile in 1935, and there were some other big names or legends from human physiology as Adams, Grover and Reeves, and Bruno Balke, the creator of the Balke test. However, by that time there were no research published which had been conducted or carried out at 4,000 meter altitude or 13,000 feet, as it is the case from Nuñoa. Besides research conducted by Dil Balke in hypobaric chambers, which simulated elevations greater than 4,000 meters. And I have shared some issues of the altitude collection infographics about this research. So I guess Buskirk accepted the deal, and he was the one who led the clinical physiology series of studies who were carried out in Nuñoa in January, in the month of January 1965. The dates are quite confusing because only the second article, the one published in the Journal of Physiology in August 1967, described what were the different dates of the travel, the sojourn, and different tests that they were performing in different altitude venues. And I will be talking about this through the video. But in this article, in the one that we are addressing today about the thermoregulation to cold stress, they mentioned that the participants from the Caucasian groups or from the lowlanders group, which I will define later, they had been exposed to the altitude of Nuñoa from 1 to 8 months. So I don't know exactly when these participants from the Penn State University arrived to Nuñoa. So I guess if this was conducted in January 1965, they might arrive around, some of the participants, they arrived around April to May. I think, my opinion, is that Buskirk and some other colleagues, as some participants were the same research members of the expedition and postgraduate students from Penn State, I think they started to work on the logistics, on the big logistics of this study, and they arrived maybe 8 months before the test or the different experiments were conducted in January 1965. Why big logistics? Because that was the first experiment where high-level athletes from the team or from Penn State track and field team were part of the participants. And in fact, one of them had clocked in the 1 mile distance, 4 minutes 9 seconds before he attended to the high altitude of Nuñoa. So that's a really, really, really good time for the 60s. Then they set up a lab in Nuñoa, a laboratory in Nuñoa, which was basically a small lab where different psychoergometers like monarchs were brought from the Penn State University to the Andean Altiplano. Then they built a dust track at 2 lanes, dust track with the same measurements of a regular 400-meter track. And of course they transported heavy stuff as Douglas bags, as the monarchs, and different instruments that they use for different physiological parameters assessment. We have also to consider that there were 4 research sites or venues in this research as Penn State, where the pre and post altitude tests were conducted. And that was basically the baseline of the high altitude research. Then they also so 3 athletes stay in Nuñoa during 63 days, and 3 athletes, the American track and field athletes, they stay 48 days in Nuñoa, and they then went to the laboratory of the Mount Evans, which is located a bit higher than Nuñoa. It's located at an elevation of 4,500 meters, or around 14,500 feet approximately. Then, so they stayed there 1 week. Then they moved down to a moderate altitude town as Alamosa in Colorado, which is placed at 2,300 meters elevation. And they stay there for 1 week, and they also compete in one track event. And then, but this data is not published, they also assessed those athletes at the Jewish hospital in Denver, and this data, as also the data from the Mount Evans and Alamosa, have never been published elsewhere. So, we have to consider that in the 60s, this scientific expedition moved from Penn State, flying from Philadelphia to Miami, then from Miami to Lima, and then from Lima to Cusco, and then they took a road trip to Nuñoa. I think by that time that road trip would take them around 4 hours because these roads are quite steep, quite dangerous, and they are in a very remote area of the Puno region, because Nuñoa is not in the Cusco region, it's part of the Puno region or Puno department. So why Nuñoa was chosen by Paul Baker and Elsworth Buskirk as the town to conduct these clinical and exercise physiology studies? It was very simple. There were no studies at 4,000 meter published by that time. I mean, studies in which athletes from the lowlands or lowlanders had been exposed to an elevation of 4,000 meters. And because of that, both researchers decide to perform that. Also, we have to understand that Nuñoa in the 60s was a very, very, very tiny town, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people. And it was a quiet place. So, we have to understand that Nuñoa nowadays still being the most, or still have the number one ranking about the most number of articles per square kilometers or per square miles on Earth regarding publications about human physiology of the high altitude. I mean, I think only in Nepal, Periche at 4,300 meters and Nanche Bazar will be fighting close to Nuñoa for getting the number one position of this ranking. Nowadays, there are a lot of studies published in the Chinese plateau at 52,000 meters or 5,000 meters, in La Rinconada at around 5,000 meter elevation, and in Cerro de Pasco, Peru, at 4,300 meter elevations. But if we consider the dimension of this town, it is very, very, very crazy, very astonishing, the number of publications which have been published in a town from the remote Altiplano, which only was basically surviving because of the breeding and agriculture, like farming and breeding, main economic factors of this town. So it's very interesting to me why Nuñoa and what Nuñoa starting to develop in terms of different biological scientific fields that has been published in so many journals and so many impact or high impact journals in the globe. In the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking about the history of the physiology studies which has been carried out in Andes. So, if we move back, or we just do a long journey in the time of 130 years, we can talk about the study which was conducted by Biot in 1891. He conducted this study in the town of Chicla and in the town of Morococha. Chicla is located at 3,700 meter altitude, and Morococha is at around 4,500 meter or 15,000 feet. So Biot was a French doctor, and he moved from Europe to Peru to carry out or to lead this study. He assessed not only humans, he assessed also animals, and he observed an increase of the red cell volume or the hematopoiesis in different animals who were living in these towns. And also he observed the same physiological mechanism among lowlanders who were workers of this mining company. They were working as officers or administrators, but they were not natives from the altitude. And also he observed the same among high altitude dwellers or highlanders who were natives from the altitudes. They were Quechuas. I have to also emphasize that some workers they were living many years in Peru, but they have an European ancestry. He mentioned workers from Germany and some parts of Europe. Interestingly, and I have previously mentioned it in this video, the old town of Morococha, where the place where this study was conducted. As I have to inform that in this old town, it is a mining site town, there was a ground subsidence, and a few years ago the Peru government decided to rebuild a new Morococha because so many mining companies still operating in this area of the central road of Peru. So we have to understand that mining was a foreign business. China and the USA especially are the main countries which have decided to invest in the mining business in several countries from Andes. So workers or the miners were basically Andeans. They can be Aymaras or Quechuas, and administrators or officers were Caucasians or low altitude dwellers. This was called by this time Indians versus whites, and nowadays I have read several papers where they still mention this word, okay, which is a discriminative term. Nowadays I have read, for instance, recently a paper from Basniat who was published in 2011 and described participants of the study as Quechua Indians. So we have to try to be correct when we describe the participants and the ethnicity of the participants. In 1921, it was carried out the first scientific expedition in Andes. And also I have addressed this expedition in one of the contents of my blog. In fact, I didn't mention, but as I did with the Biol study, I also designed an altitude collection infographic about the Prokop expeditions. In this time, or in this occasion, for these 200 pages medicine theatres, I designed 10 infographics. I will show some of them in the upcoming slide or part or section of the video, wherever you mention it. So, in 1921, those scientists from Europe and from USA, they moved to Peru, to Cerro de Pasco at 4,300 meters elevation, and during few weeks they established several aspects regarding cardiorespiratory physiology especially. And also interestingly, they set 2 labs on 2 train wagons because they were traveling from Lima sea level by train through the central train road, and they were assessing in the different stops of the train to several participants as themselves. They did a self-assessment. So they stopped in Matucana, they stopped in the Ticlio Pass at 4,800 meters, and then they went down to La Oroya, and finally they reached the town of Cerro de Pasco. They stay right there during a few weeks, and the book is extraordinary, and I have tried to summarize it in 10 infographics of the altitude collection infographics. In 1925, 4 years later, the Dr. Carlos Monge from University of San Marcos in Lima, he discovered the chronic mountain sickness, or Monge's disease. I have also shared one infographic about research that Carlos Monge and Hurtado conducted in 1927, and they were studying the differences in the metabolism from people or highlanders who were living in several highlands areas from Peru. They compared with people who were living in the tropical area, as the Peruvian jungle. So I will share after this short video. From this point, and from the 30s, the Peruvian researchers in human physiology of several fields, especially cardiorespiratory, they were way ahead of Europeans as Christensen and Edwards. If no one knows who is Christensen was the thesis director from Ben Saltin, who along with Per-Olof Astrand, they were both considered the best exercise physiologists from the 28th century. And also they were way ahead of the Americans as Consolacio, Talbot, Dill. I will be talking about Dill in a few minutes because I'm gonna be addressing in my blog a research that they conducted in 1935. So, from this point, researchers from Peru or medical doctors as Alberto Hurtado and Carlos Monge, they start to making connections with American researchers, because most of them, they were doing their doctorate in the USA, different institutions from the USA, and the USA researchers and the Peruvian researchers start in the 40s to publish a lot of papers around about different fields of the human, especially clinical physiology. In 1934, it was Dr. Alberto Hurtado, that I have previously mentioned, that he was pupil from Dr. Carlos Monge. So Alberto Hurtado and his colleagues Carl Trader and McKen from the Rochester School of Medicine, they discovered the pulmonary emphysema of the high altitude in the hypobaric chamber from this medical institution. How did they discover them? They assessed it. I think there were 5 participants who were acute exposure, like 2 hours to an altitude simulating near 5,000 meter elevation. And they also exposure guinea pigs that afterwards they dissection it, and with this anatomical study they observed the anatomic changes that the high altitude have triggered. In between these changes, they observed a central part of the lungs, like dilated, and the peripheral areas, they were constricted. There was a vasoconstriction. So after this study that was linked to suffering some diseases as the pulmonary edema and its relation with the cerebral edema. So I have also shared this research in an issue of the altitude collection infographics, and I will show you in a few minutes. It is 1 year after, in 1935, when Thiel, Talbot and Consolacio, along with so many researchers from Europe and from the United States, they moved to Chile, to different areas from Chile, to study several fields, not only from the human physiology, also from the human psychology. In fact, I have shared a study about the role of ascension effects from one researcher, McFarland, who not only researched or assessed physiological variables, he also measured some psychological variables. This study was conducted as the one I will be addressing soon in my blog from Thiel and colleagues in 1935, but both studies were published in 1937. In the study from Thiel and colleagues, they reported the physical and chemical blood properties that they observed at high altitude among highlanders and lowlanders, as they used to do in this area. They were self-assessed, so some scientists were same participants of the study, and they used to be the control group. the comparison groups with the Highlanders. So this will be a new entry. As all of us in this room have listened from the physiologist Kostil was during so many years the colleague from Deal, and they have published not only a lot of articles, they published as well many book chapters and books. Okay, so this is something interesting to know. So in the early 50s, the US government financed the creation of the highest laboratory on Earth, in which there would be studied the physiological and physiopathological mechanisms triggered by the high altitude. That laboratory was built in Morococha, in the old mining town from Morococha, at an altitude of 4,550 meters or 15,000 feet. His director was Dr. Alberto Hurtado, and Dr. Carlos Monge was the director of the Instituto Andino de Biología de la Altura, or what is known as Andean Institute of Biology of the Altitude. So, this was an institution of the Universidad Mayor de San Marcos in Lima, and this university and institution were managing this high altitude lab. By that time, the Mount Evans lab in Colorado was not already been created. So the USA financed this institute, and so many research were conducted by both American and Peruvian scientists of the exercise and clinical physiology of the high altitude. So the main characteristic of this laboratory was that, different from some others laboratories that were working by that time, in this laboratory the participants were residing in that area because they were workers from any mining company that was in Morococha. And that was interesting because that issue could researchers allow them to compare, for instance, Caucasians as the same researchers with high altitude natives who were living in the same scenario. I will show you some pictures of the laboratory. So, once this lab disappeared, these conditions have never occurred again. Nobody have been living or residing in the Mount Evans area, neither in the Pyramid Laboratory from Nepal at 5,100 meters. And nowadays, there are so many studies and experiments being conducted in La Rinconada at 5,100 meters or Cerro de Pasco at 4,300 meters. So, to understand more about how important was this laboratory, I highly recommend the conference from Dr. Dante Peñaloza, which, in my personal opinion, is the best ever researcher of clinical physiology, especially in cardiology and cardiorespiratory adaptation to altitude, the Dr. Dante Peñaloza, which was especially who was an enthusiast, and I highly recommend a conference which is posted in YouTube, and you will know a lot more about the research and the studies that they were conducted in Morococha. In fact, I have published it in my blog tribute to him and another cardiologist who was Dr. Emilio Martecorena, and I will show you afterwards the issues of the altitude collection infographics and some pictures of my blog entries that I published it as a tribute to both of them. They were top clinical physiology researchers and worked side by side with Dr. Grover in the field, especially of the cardiorespiratory physiology. In fact, Grover and Peñaloza discovered the hypertension in both adults and kids who were residing at high altitude, and Martecorena discovered the arterial pulmonary hypertension that exists or it's induced when we exercise it at high altitude. I will talk a little bit about this in a few minutes. Dr. Grover conducted their experiments in Leadville, in Colorado, at around 3,100 meter altitude, and the two Peruvians were carry out their experiments in Morococha or some other areas from Peru. Anyways, Dr. Grover also moves several times to Peru, and also he conducted experiments with animals, because he was also expert in right hair catheteris techniques. So before I forgot it, there was another main characteristic from Morococha Lab. Morococha Lab was a 4,500 meter or 15,000 feet elevation. But then they have another assessment station where the mine entry of the workers was located at 16,000 feet. This was called the San Nicolas station. And I will share you one picture of both the lab and the San Nicolas station. So, to finish with the history or the previous history before the study that we will address in the upcoming chapters, which is the Nuñoa study of 1965, I have to mention, or I have to double mention or mention again, that in 1964, Dr. Emilio Martecorena discovered with a clinical physiology experiment carried out in Morococha the arterial pulmonary hypertension while exercising with a cycle ergometer. What they did was they instrumented the participant with a right hair catheterization, and with a tremendous effort of his group, Dr. Banchero, Dr. Sime, Dr. Peñaloza, Dr. Cruz, and Dr. Gamboa, they report this astonishing finding for that year 1964. Dr. Marty Correa, who I previously told you that I dedicated a tribute in my blog, he was a cardiologist in the hospital of Chulec in La Oroya. La Oroya is a mining town which is at 3,700 meters nearby Cerro de Pasco. So this is the last study I wanted to share before I start to talk about some other points from the Nuñoa study carried out in 1964, 1965 by the Penn State researchers. Hope you like it and enjoy this long chapter, and I'll see you soon with the second part of this second episode. Bye, and I hope you enjoy it.